Weezer and the Painted Frog by Kitty Sutton. Published by Ink and Beans Press. Chapter 1. The dog had been running from sheer panic, without any clue about where he was, nor did he take the time to stop and look around himself. He had been so frightened by the big boom, a sound he had never heard before, that he had run blindly into the forest. As he ran deeper into this unknown place, everything became foreign to him, even the smell of the land. As he frantically ran, he took no notice of the splotches of blood that sprang from his paws as each hit the moldy ground, strewn with sharp rocks. His mostly white fur, coupled with small brown patches, began collecting thick knots of burrs and small crawling things on his otherwise clean coat. His heart thumped as it pumped, combining with his desperate panting, filling his ears, blocking out all other sounds. The all-consuming rush of fear forced his muscles onward, working flat out. His lungs burned painfully now, and his breath began growing shorter, shallower. His blood-red tongue lolled sideways, hanging to cool in the wind, while white, foamy flecks of spittle kept flying in all directions from its surface, draining him of much-needed moisture. His ears, eyes, and nose tried scanning ahead, sideways, behind, but mostly behind. Was the terrible thing following him? He wouldn't be able to run much longer. His gait was already getting erratic, but the wild surge that had sent him flying in bounds over boulders and branches, crashing and smashing through bushes as though there were none there, was still prodding him. In a storm of twigs, cracking and snapping, vines tearing, branches whipping at his passage, he pushed further into the unknown forest. His stride was no longer a gallop, running now, body elongated, low, close to the ground, next to the leafy mat, as foxes would run when he hunted them. Trotting now, staggering ever so slightly. He knew he must turn and fight, or drop and hide. The blood pumping in his ears was not so loud any more. Pain throbbed in the torn flesh of his paws, and his burning muscles and lungs demanded that he cease his mad dash. As quickly as it had begun, his mad run now stopped. He stood trembling in the twilight of this unfamiliar forest, looking in every direction for any movement that might indicate danger to him. He looked slowly behind, halting, puzzled. He cautiously trod toward the setting sun, which he could barely see through the thick trees. His heart still raced, for the panic in him was still close to the surface, and his skin flicked and rippled in waves from head to tail as he proceeded, trying to get his bearings. He topped a ridge and stopped cold in his tracks, panting in his thirst. He stared at the panoramic scene before him. An endless forest lay as far as his keen dog eyes could see, undulating with high ridges and deep hollows, almost black and bottomless. He turned in a circle, not knowing what direction to step. Finally, his thirst won out, and satisfying it became his only goal. In the fading light he noticed well-worn trails extending across the ridge he perched on and down the slope. Guided by instinct alone, he moved forward and down, heading down the trail while taking care to listen to the forest noises. A soft breeze buffeted the leaves around him, warm and perfumed with all the forest scents. Sensing he was losing his light, he quickened his pace. As he followed the path, other trails joined it, as if all were pointing the way. When darkness was almost complete, he came to a small mountain spring with cold, sparkling water trickling over the rocks. No other animals were at the spring yet, so he slaked his monumental thirst. He gazed at the moonlight reflecting off the small stream. He calmed and breathed deeply. Feeling vulnerable, he moved off into the forest a little way, circled several times upon some fern plants, then lay down. He could keep his eyes open no longer then, and sleep overtook him. Sasa, a girl of the Cherokee, sat next to a dry, waterless creek bed. She could feel the thick dust with drying traces of long-shed tears coating her rounded cheeks under large black-brown eyes. She had no family now. Her parents, an extended family of aunts, uncles, cousins, and all the rest had made the long walk from their traditional Cherokee lands, now many moons away to the east. As they walked a few more miles each day, she had watched her family grow weak and sick, and now she thought it had almost been a blessing for some families when their elders and children were slaughtered by white settlers before the soldiers forced them to the west. Then she had thought that her immediate family had escaped succumbing to sickness, starvation, and death on the trail. But after the soldiers ended their long travail, they left them alone with many new problems. All the people needed homes, food, and medicine. Her red calico skirt and blouse were exceedingly worn and stained from endless days of walking. No amount of washing would ever remove the dirt from sleeping on the ground every night, nor the blood from her cuts and scrapes. She still wore the moccasins her mother had made her, and that she had resoled several times with old hides that had been given to her. They were almost unwearable now, and even though she had repaired them, most of the beads her mother had sewn on them were gone now. Her raven hair was cropped short just under her ears. With each death in her family, she cut a little more off. Her mother would have hated the cutting of her hair. "My little swan, my little Sasa," she always said, "how beautiful you are with your long black hair. Be sure to comb it every day with the carved shell comb your father made you." But there was no one left to worry if she combed it or not. In some ways, this northeast corner of Indian Territory seemed similar to the forested slopes of her traditional home in the east, but it was much drier, and the land was flatter to the west of her new camp. There were green forests to the east, but the west offered only endless vistas of rock and prairie. In a very few places there were well-watered streams and land that could be farmed, but it was not nearly as rich as the land they had left. Her homeland of verdant green had been very different from Indian Territory. It was possible her people could make it here with hard work and determination. Unfortunately, they had been made to march with only the clothes on their backs and lacked weapons to make meat with until the government sent supplies for them. The soldiers departed, and the people were left to live or die as they might. But the winter had taken its toll, and her mother was the first to die in the new land. Even after they found ways to gather the wild, unfamiliar roots, fish the streams, or snare small game, the people continued to die. The survivors began to call the forced march that brought them to this new land Nanuhi, Duna, Delo, Hilui, the trail where they cried. But it was worse than the name implied. Daily walking through the camp of survivors, Sasa heard stories about the long walk, tales of death, each as bad as the next, that chilled her to the core. She had been a witness to many of those stories. Others were new and frightening. Some said the dead were lucky because the living were still suffering, while the dead were not. She had heard of beatings, rapes, and robbery by white settlers on the trail. She had experienced walking in snow and ice with no shoes and no blanket, and had seen the effects of cholera, smallpox, and many other deadly diseases they knew no name for. It was printed in the white man's newspaper that the blankets given to some of the Cherokees waiting at different forts before the long walk were brought from a smallpox hospital without disinfecting them. The tribe had been rounded up, allowing them nothing from their homes, and packed into stockades with no shelter, where fires were not allowed and sanitary arrangements were non-existent. They waited for months through the rest of the summer. Then, in winter, were cruelly marched 1,100 miles from Georgia through Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, and down through Arkansas and into Indian Territory. Sasa had also heard unbearably sad accounts, such as the one about a boat carrying over 800 Cherokees that had overturned in the Mississippi River and caused at least 400 people to drown. Sasa did not question the stories because she had experienced firsthand the cruelties of the trip. She and her family had traveled with Chief Ross and his family as they marched with the rest of the tribe. Ustayansa had walked bravely with the refugees as well, but his blanket had been taken from him by a roadside gang of hecklers. Mrs. Ross, whom they called Quati, saw him and noticed his lips were blue as he shivered violently. "Look, John, little Buffalo will not make it much longer if he does not get warm," Quati said as she shivered. "How many more babies and young have to die on this cursed march?" Quati already had a cold, but she took one look at Ustayansa and gave him her only blanket. Her cold turned into pneumonia, and she died a few days from Indian Territory. It was ironic to Sasa that Quati gave her life to help Sasa's little brother live, just to have him die later on for no reason at all. Her family had the same problems as the others did, for they had no tools with which to bury the dead. Her tribe believed that the dead should be buried the day after death to complete the cycle of life set out by the Creator. But it was winter. The ground was too frozen to dig. Everywhere the sight of stiff bodies that would rot when the weather warmed up was enveloped in the sound of a numb silence. For without their old and young ones who had died on the trail, the living felt dead already. The time seemed only yesterday, but it was plain that many moons had passed. They had arrived in winter, and now it was very early summer. When all the survivors had arrived, it was evident that there were no longer many old ones to ask for advice about how to live in this new land. There were few elders and extremely few young.